At my own daughter's wedding, I was treated like a stranger, like I didn't even belong. They handed me a plaque that said, "Guest with limited access." Her new mother-in-law laughed, and I'll never forget that sound. It cut through the music, the chatter, the clinking of champagne glasses. It wasn't just laughter, it was mockery, directed straight at me, and that was the moment I decided, enough. I had poured my life into raising my daughter. I worked double shifts, gave up vacations, skipped new clothes for myself so she could have everything she ever needed. When she called me in tears over rent in college, I was the one wiring the money. When her car broke down, I took out a loan just so she wouldn't miss her classes. And when she said, "Mom, I want the wedding of my dreams," I wrote a check for $140,000. I thought that was love. I thought that was loyalty. But what I received in return was humiliation in front of hundreds of guests. As I sat there with that plaque in my hand, I felt a storm inside me. My daughter stood on the altar glowing in her white gown. But when I looked at her, I didn't see the little girl I raised. I saw a woman who let another family strip me of my dignity. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just a guest at her wedding. I was an outsider in her life. Now, before I tell you what I did next, I want to ask you, what would you do if your own child stood by while others treated you like you were invisible? Would you swallow your pride and smile for the cameras? Or would you stand up, even if it meant losing the child you sacrificed everything for? If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story reached. Don't just watch in silence. Your support means more than you think. Some betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people you love most, the people you would give your last breath for. That day, sitting in the back of a wedding I had paid for, but wasn't welcome in, I realized I had been cast in a role I never auditioned for. The forgotten mother. And when the laughter of her mother-in-law echoed in my ears, I knew I couldn't stay silent. My revenge wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be messy, but it would leave a mark they'd never forget. I was never handed an easy life. I didn't come from wealth, and I didn't have a partner who stayed when things got hard. My daughter's father walked out before she could even say the word, "Daddy." The man who promised to be by my side disappeared when the responsibility of family became too heavy for him. I still remember the day I stood at the kitchen sink, washing bottles while holding her on my hip, realizing it was just me from then on. No backup, no safety net, just me. So I became everything. I was mother, father, provider, protector. I woke up before the sun, packed lunches with peanut butter sandwiches and apple slices, ironed uniforms that smelled faintly of starch, and walked her to the bus stop with a smile even when my body ached from the night shift. Then I'd clock in at work, spend 8 hours on my feet, and clock right into a second job. While other parents were sitting at school plays together, I was racing from the diner to the grocery store, squeezing every dollar to stretch further than it could. There were days I came home so tired I wanted to collapse on the couch and never get up. But she needed help with homework, so I'd sit there, sounding out spelling words, drilling multiplication tables, keeping my eyes open because I couldn't afford to fail her. When she asked about her father, I swallowed the lump in my throat and said he loved her in his own way. I never told her the truth, that he left because responsibility wasn't convenient for him. I wanted her to keep her innocence for as long as possible. As she grew, so did the sacrifices. She wanted to play soccer, so I worked extra shifts at the hospital cafeteria to buy cleats. She wanted to join the school choir, so I sold my old jewelry to pay for the costume. When prom season came around, I sat at the sewing machine night after night, piecing together satin and lace until her dress was perfect. Not a store-bought gown, but something made with my hands, my sweat, and every bit of love I had left in me. I remember watching her walk down the stairs in that dress, the way her eyes lit up, and thinking, this is worth everything. The bills never stopped piling up. There was always something. The electricity on the verge of being cut, the landlord threatening eviction, The car breaking down right before payday. I learned how to make pasta stretch 3 nights in a row, how to patch sneakers with glue, how to swallow my pride and accept hand-me-downs. My coworkers would brag about trips to Disney or new cars while I quietly counted change to cover groceries. Still, I never let my daughter see me break. She saw a mother who always found a way, not a woman crying into her pillow at midnight, wondering how she would survive the next month. College came, and with it, a new mountain. Tuition notices arrived, and I stared at numbers I couldn't even process. I picked up overtime, cut out every luxury, and even cleaned houses on weekends. When she called crying because her rent check bounced, I sent money I didn't have. When her car broke down during finals, I signed for a small loan and told her not to worry. I carried her burdens quietly, so her shoulders would never feel their weight. Every Christmas, I skipped gifts for myself, so she could have what she wanted under the tree. I remember one year, I wrapped a pair of sneakers she had been eyeing for months. I watched her open the box and squeal with joy, while my own shoes had holes in them. That was my life, giving until there was nothing left for me. And I told myself, one day, it will all be worth it. When she got engaged, I thought that day had come. She called me with excitement in her voice, saying, "Mom, I found the one. We're going to start our forever." And in that moment, I thought of every sacrifice, every tear, every sleepless night, and I felt a sense of relief. Maybe now she would see me. Maybe now she would understand that every choice I made was for her. The wedding became the new mountain. She dreamed of a grand ceremony, something straight out of a magazine. I knew I couldn't afford it. I knew my savings were barely enough to cover my own retirement. But I also knew this was her moment, and I wanted her to have it. So I opened an account, put in everything I had, and signed over $140,000 to cover her dream. That money was meant to secure my old age, to keep a roof over my head when I couldn't work anymore. But I looked at my daughter, and I thought, this is my gift, this is my legacy. No one will ever understand the weight of that decision. The nights I sat at my kitchen table with stacks of bills, the way my hands shook as I wrote that check, the hollow pit in my stomach, knowing I was giving away my safety net. But I convinced myself it was right. I told myself this was the final act of love, the sacrifice that would show her just how much she meant to me. I believed that wedding would be a celebration of us both, her future and my devotion. I never imagined it would become the stage for my greatest humiliation. When my daughter first told me about Michael, I could hear a lightness in her voice that I hadn't heard in years. She described him as kind, ambitious, and from a family who seemed to have everything figured out. He came from money, the kind of money I had only seen in magazines, with a family that hosted charity galas and vacationed in places I couldn't pronounce. For the first time in a long while, I thought maybe my daughter's life was about to become easier than mine ever was. The first time I met him, he was polite, well-spoken, the kind of man who shook my hand with a smile that felt rehearsed. He complimented my daughter, spoke about his career goals, and seemed eager to win approval. But behind that polished surface, there was something that didn't sit right with me. Something in his eyes that felt transactional, as though love was another deal to secure. Still, my daughter's happiness was all I cared about, so I pushed my doubts aside. It wasn't long before I met his mother, Barbara. From the moment she walked into the room, I knew exactly what kind of woman she was. Her presence filled the space, not with warmth, but with judgment. She glanced at my modest living room, as though the walls themselves offended her. Her eyes landed on the old couch I had kept for years, on the chipped coffee table that had survived countless homework sessions and late-night meals, and her lips curved in the faintest smile, not of kindness, but of quiet superiority. She spoke with a voice that dripped with condescension, asking where I worked, how long I had lived in that neighborhood, if I had ever traveled outside the country. Every question felt less like curiosity and more like a reminder that, in her world, people like me were small. I answered politely, but inside, I felt that familiar sting of not being enough. The engagement was announced not long after, and suddenly, Barbara was everywhere. She inserted herself into every conversation, every decision, every detail. When I suggested venues that were beautiful, but within reason, she scoffed and said, "Oh, Michael deserves something far grander than that." When I offered to host a small family dinner to celebrate, she dismissed the idea, saying their circle expected more. My daughter smiled awkwardly, caught between us, but never once defended me. It wasn't just the big decisions, it was the little cuts that added up. One evening, my daughter mentioned a group chat where the wedding planning was being discussed. I waited for the invitation, but it never came. Weeks later, I learned they had chosen the venue, the florist, and even the color scheme without me. My daughter brushed it off, saying, "Mom, it's just easier this way. Barbara knows so many people." What she didn't see, or didn't want to see, was that I had been erased from the process entirely. I tried to hold on, tried to contribute in the ways I could. For the engagement party, I stayed up late in my small kitchen, baking batch after batch of cookies, the same ones my daughter grew up with: chocolate chip, snickerdoodles, oatmeal raisin, the recipes she loved since childhood. I packed them carefully into decorative tins, tied ribbons around them, and carried them with pride to the celebration. When I arrived, Barbara was directing the caterers, her hands fluttering as she arranged platters of imported cheeses and champagne flutes that shimmered in the light. I set the tins on the table, hoping my daughter would smile and say, "These are Mom's, my favorite." Instead, Barbara glanced at them, wrinkled her nose, and said, "Oh, homemade? How quaint. Let's set them off to the side." The words stung, but the worst part was the silence that followed. My daughter said nothing. She didn't take my hand, didn't defend me, didn't remind Barbara that those cookies were part of her childhood. She just stood there, adjusting her ring, as though my effort embarrassed her. I watched as guests passed by the tins without a second glance, while Barbara's catered spread drew admiration. My heart broke quietly in that corner, realizing my love was invisible in a room filled with strangers. As the months went on, the pattern repeated. I offered ideas. I was dismissed. I asked questions. I was ignored. The further we got into the engagement, the further away my daughter seemed from me. She was glowing in her new life, wrapped in the wealth and approval of Michael's family, while I became a shadow trailing behind. I told myself this was temporary, that the wedding would bring us back together. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. Every time Barbara made a remark about my clothes, about my car, about the way I spoke, I bit my tongue. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to ruin my daughter's happiness. I told myself this was her dream, and I could endure anything to see her smile. But each insult chipped away at me. Each exclusion widened the distance. By the time the wedding was near, I realized I had been reduced to a spectator in a life I had built with my own two hands. I thought once the engagement excitement settled, my daughter and I would have those late-night talks I always dreamed of, the kind where we'd flip through bridal magazines together, circle dresses we loved, and imagine how she'd look walking down the aisle. I thought we'd laugh about centerpieces, argue playfully about cake flavors, and hold hands as we planned one of the most beautiful days of her life. But instead, I found myself standing on the outside, peering into a world where I no longer belonged. The money I had given, the $140,000 I worked myself raw to save, suddenly became invisible. It didn't buy me a seat at the table. It didn't earn me a voice in the decisions. The moment I handed that envelope over, I became what Barbara, her soon-to-be mother-in-law, always wanted me to be. Silent, replaceable, erased. I remember the first time I realized how far they'd gone. There was a group chat, my daughter, Michael, and Barbara. They shared updates, ideas, appointments, and vendors. I wasn't in it. I found out because my daughter slipped one night, mentioning a cake tasting I had never even heard about. When I asked why I wasn't invited, she said it was last minute, that she forgot to tell me. But I saw the guilt flicker in her eyes. She hadn't forgotten. She'd chosen not to tell me. The venue was booked without me. I saw the glossy brochure tucked under a stack of mail on my daughter's counter. A grand estate, all marble floors and chandeliers. Nothing like the cozy, heartfelt ceremony we had once whispered about years ago. I asked her about it, and she just said, "Barbara insisted. She knows people there." That word, insisted, it became the soundtrack of those months. Barbara insisted on the venue. Barbara insisted on the catering. Barbara insisted on the dress. I offered to take my daughter dress shopping, something I had dreamed about since she was a little girl, draping old sheets around herself, pretending to be a bride. She hesitated, then said softly, "I already went with Barbara." She thought it'd be better to do it quietly. Quietly, without me. I smiled through the ache in my chest, nodding as if I understood. But that night, alone in my kitchen, I held a photo she had texted me of her in the gown. She looked radiant, yes, but all I could think was that I hadn't been there to zip her into it, to cry at how beautiful she looked, to feel that moment every mother longs for. The guest list became another battlefield. I wanted to invite a few of my closest friends, people who had watched my daughter grow up, who had carried us through hard years when her father was gone. But my suggestions were brushed aside. "We're keeping it tight," my daughter said. Later, I overheard Barbara boasting about inviting her colleagues and bridge club friends. Tight for me, but wide open for her. I tried small gestures, hoping to find my place again. One evening I stayed up baking trays of my daughter's favorite cookies, chocolate chip with just the right amount of sea salt. I wrapped them neatly, tied ribbons around each box, and brought them to the engagement party. I placed them carefully on the dessert table, thinking they might bring a warm, personal touch among the catered sweets. But I watched as Barbara wrinkled her nose and whispered, just loud enough, "Too homemade." She moved them aside, placing them behind rows of glossy pastries that sparkled under the lights. My daughter laughed awkwardly and said nothing. I stood there, hands clasped together, as if holding myself together was the only thing I could do. Nights became lonelier. I would send my daughter texts late into the evening. Questions about flowers, ideas for music, little reminders about traditions that meant something to us. More often than not, those messages were left on read. The glowing check mark on my phone felt like a wall. She had seen my words, but she didn't answer. I would stare at the screen, waiting for the dots that never appeared. Eventually, I stopped expecting a reply. The deeper we went into the planning, the more it felt like a theft, not just of my money, but of my motherhood. All the years of raising her alone, of saving every penny, of holding her hand through every disappointment. They were erased in favor of chandeliers and seating charts decided by someone else. I was being rewritten out of my daughter's story, as if my only role was to pay the bill and stand quietly in the shadows. And yet, I couldn't walk away. I told myself, this is for her, this is her day. I swallowed the insults, the exclusions, the cold stares from Barbara that told me I was small, unworthy, a relic of a life my daughter had already outgrown. I let the tears fall only when no one was around, and every morning I plastered on a smile, pretending I was fine. But deep down, I felt a shift, a fracture that no amount of plaster could mend, because it wasn't just a wedding being planned. It was the slow dismantling of everything I thought I had with my daughter, the bond, the trust, the love. And each decision made without me, each whisper behind my back, each text left unanswered, pulled another brick out of the foundation I had built. By the time the invitations went out, embossed and gold-trimmed, I realized something chilling. I wasn't the mother of the bride anymore. I was just another name on a guest list someone else had written. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of my mirror longer than usual, staring at a woman who had aged too quickly. The sleepless nights, the quiet tears, the endless sacrifices, they all seemed etched into my face. I smoothed down my dress, the one I had chosen carefully. It wasn't extravagant, but it was elegant enough that I hoped my daughter would be proud to stand next to me in photographs. I told myself, that no matter what had happened during the planning, today was about her. Today I would be her mother, her anchor, the person she could look to in the crowd and know she was loved. I arrived at the venue, with my heart still clinging to hope. The estate was breathtaking, every corner dripping in flowers and crystal, a display of wealth and grandeur that screamed Barbara's touch. My eyes searched the crowd, looking for my daughter. When I finally saw her, my breath caught. She looked radiant, like the little girl who used to twirl in my kitchen in makeshift gowns made from bed sheets. For a fleeting second, I imagined she would rush into my arms, whisper that she missed me, thank me for everything I had done to make this day possible. But instead, I was met with cold stares. Barbara's friends glanced at me as though I didn't belong. Their whispers carried across the air, subtle enough to deny, but sharp enough to cut. I walked carefully, every step heavy, with the realization that I was an outsider at my own daughter's wedding. My smile trembled, but I held it in place, refusing to let them see how much it hurt. At the entrance, a young usher held out a plaque to me. I thought it was some kind of seating card, perhaps a small gift for guests, but as I read the words, my stomach turned to stone. Guest with limited access. I blinked, thinking there must be some mistake. I looked up at the usher, confused, but he only shrugged and motioned me forward. And then I heard it, the sound of Barbara's laughter, loud, sharp, deliberate. It cut through the chatter of the room and landed squarely on me. I glanced toward her, and she was smirking, her eyes gleaming with triumph, as if she had finally won a battle I hadn't even realized I was fighting. I waited for my daughter to say something, to step in, to take my arm and tear that plaque away in defiance. But she stood frozen, her lips pressed into a thin line, her silence louder than any words could have been. She didn't defend me, she didn't shield me, she let it happen. I clutched the plaque to my chest, my hands trembling, my throat burning with words I couldn't say. Around me, the whispers grew louder. Limited access. Is that her mother? Their laughter mixed with Barbara's, and I felt myself shrinking under the weight of their judgment. I found my seat, a chair pushed to the edge of the reception, far from the family table, where Barbara held court like a queen. I sat quietly, my back straight, forcing myself to breathe evenly, while humiliation wrapped itself around me like a shroud. Every toast, every cheer, every moment that should have been ours, felt like a reminder that I had been stripped of my place. I watched my daughter dance her first dance, her hand in Michael's, her smile radiant under the lights. My heart swelled with pride and shattered with grief all at once. I thought of the nights I rocked her to sleep when fevers wouldn't break, the mornings I packed her lunches with notes tucked inside, the afternoons I cheered at her school plays when no one else showed up. I had given her everything, and here I was, treated as though I was nothing more than a stranger who had wandered in uninvited. When the meal was served, I noticed my plate came later than everyone else's, as if even the staff had been instructed to remember my place. And when family photos were taken, Barbara directed the photographer with such authority that I was barely included. A quick, stiff smile, and then I was ushered out of the frame, as though my presence was an inconvenience. I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, tears stinging but refusing to fall. Inside, a storm raged, a mixture of heartbreak, rage, and disbelief. How could my own daughter let this happen? How could she stand by while her mother was humiliated in front of strangers? As the night wore on, the laughter around me felt like knives. I forced myself to look composed, but inside I was breaking. Every song that played, every toast that rang out, every moment of celebration became another reminder of what I had lost. And then, as I sat there clutching that plaque, one question rose in my mind, sharp and unrelenting. Can you imagine sitting at your child's wedding, treated as less than family? After years of sacrifice, after giving all you had, could you endure being reduced to a guest with limited access? That night, I knew something inside me had changed. Love had not left me, but it had been buried beneath layers of betrayal and humiliation. And for the first time in my life, I realized that sometimes silence isn't strength, it's surrender, and I would not surrender again. I sat there for what felt like hours, clutching that plaque in my hands, feeling its weight grow heavier with every passing moment. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the polite applause after each speech, it all blurred into a single ringing in my ears. My heart wasn't just breaking anymore, it was hardening. The humiliation had cut so deep that the pain began to burn into something sharper, something that refused to be ignored. I thought about the nights I worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, the years I saved penny by penny to give my daughter a future, the sacrifices no one in that room would ever understand. And now here I was, treated like an afterthought, while the check I had written, the $140,000 I had scraped together through years of sweat and sacrifice, sat in an envelope on that gift table, as if it were just another card, as if my contribution meant nothing. In that moment, a calm washed over me, not the calm of acceptance, but the calm that comes when a decision has already been made in your heart. I rose from my chair quietly, smoothing down my dress, ignoring the curious eyes that followed me. I walked slowly, each step steady and deliberate, toward the gift table at the front of the room. The table was draped in white linen, piled high with envelopes and gifts wrapped in shimmering paper. My hands didn't shake as I reached out, sliding the envelope with my handwriting out from the stack. I held it against me, close to my chest, as though reclaiming not just the money, but every ounce of dignity that had been stripped from me that night. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Guests turned, whispers began to spread. Phones were lifted discreetly, cameras capturing the moment like vultures circling around prey. I could hear snippets of shock, disbelief. What is she doing? Is that her envelope? Did she really just take it back? But I didn't stop. I didn't look at Barbara, though I could feel her smug eyes drilling into me. I didn't look at Michael, who stood frozen near the head table. And I didn't look at my daughter, because I knew if I saw her face, it might weaken me. I kept walking, past the tables, past the curious stares, through the doors, and out into the cool night air. The air hit my lungs like a rush of freedom. For the first time that evening, I could breathe. I clutched the envelope tighter, my fingers pressing into its edges, and I told myself silently, "This is mine. This was never theirs to mock or diminish. This is the measure of my love, and I will not leave it in the hands of people who see me as less than human." I hadn't taken more than a few steps outside when I heard hurried footsteps behind me. "Mom, Mom, wait." My daughter's voice rang out, sharp with panic. I stopped, turning slowly, my eyes meeting hers, under the glow of the outdoor lights. She rushed toward me, her dress gathered in her hands, her veil slightly slipping as she stumbled in her heels. "Mom, don't do this, please," she begged, her voice trembling. For a long moment, I just stared at her, the little girl I had raised, the woman who had just allowed me to be humiliated. My heart wanted to reach for her, to hold her, to forgive her, but the wound was too fresh, too raw. I shook my head, my voice steady, but laced with years of pain. "No, you already did this to me." Her eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. She just stood there, caught between the life she had chosen and the love she had betrayed. Behind her, I could hear faint murmurs from the open doors, see the shadow of guests craning their necks to watch. Cameras were still recording, the spectacle now spilling into the night. I turned away from her, the envelope still pressed tightly against me. I didn't run. I didn't storm off. I walked calmly into the darkness, leaving behind the music, the laughter, the flashing lights of a wedding that no longer felt like it belonged to me. And as I disappeared into the night, one thought lingered, unspoken, but heavy in the air. This was not the end. This was only the beginning. When I walked away from that wedding, with the envelope pressed to my chest, I knew the choice I had made was more than just reclaiming money. It was reclaiming every ounce of respect I had allowed others to trample on. The humiliation they handed me inside that hall could have broken me, but instead, it sharpened me. And as I drove home that night, the road stretching endlessly before me, I made a decision. I would not raise my voice. I would not argue. I would not beg for recognition. My revenge would not come in screams or accusations. It would come in silence. The next morning, as sunlight filtered into my kitchen, I sat at my table with a cup of coffee, staring at the check still tucked safely in its envelope. Memories of every sacrifice I had made washed over me. Working double shifts at the diner, sewing dresses by hand, skipping meals so my daughter could eat, putting away every spare dollar I could find. That money represented decades of labor, of love, of perseverance. And I realized, with a calm certainty, that it was never theirs to squander. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I had promised more than just the $140,000. I had agreed to help with the down payment for their house, a honeymoon fund, and smaller expenses Barbara had insisted were tradition. My name was written on forms. My word had been given in good faith. But faith works both ways, and theirs had been broken the moment they chose to humiliate me. So I sat there with my coffee and made a quiet vow. Every promise I had made would now be undone. The first step was simple. I called the bank and canceled the transfer that had been scheduled for their honeymoon package. A cheerful representative confirmed it with a click of her keyboard, unaware of the satisfaction that settled in my chest as she said, "All right, ma'am, that's been taken care of." Next, I withdrew my offer for the down payment. The paperwork was still in process, so I simply signed nothing further, let it expire. My silence spoke louder than any explanation ever could. Days later, the calls began. Vendors, florists, photographers, voices sharp with frustration, started reaching out to my daughter and her husband. The grand arrangements Barbara had boasted about suddenly had no payment to secure them. The elegant honeymoon in Italy was abruptly canceled when the balance never cleared. The down payment for the new house was withdrawn, leaving Michael scrambling to explain to his bank. One by one, the pillars they thought would hold up their new life began to crumble. I didn't gloat aloud. I didn't announce what I had done. I simply watched from a distance as the carefully constructed image Barbara had curated began to crack. My daughter's phone calls grew more frequent, but I let them ring unanswered. Her text messages piled up. Pleas, excuses, apologies, even angry demands. But I left them on read, the same way she had once ignored me in those long nights of planning. Barbara, for all her arrogance, hadn't expected this. She had flaunted her influence, spoken about family money, as though it could buy anything. But the truth was clearer than ever. Much of that wedding had been built on promises of my support. Without it, their foundation was nothing more than smoke. The sweetest moment came quietly. I knew the venue had been holding its breath, waiting on final balances. With a simple, anonymous tip, I ensured they learned the truth. A polite but firm notice was delivered to the couple. Without payment, certain services would be withheld. Suddenly, the glossy photo shoot Barbara had been bragging about, magazine-worthy, she called it, was cancelled. The venue refused to release their images until the outstanding bills were cleared. The vendors followed suit, refusing further service until debts were paid in full. What had been a flawless celebration turned into a string of complaints and confrontations. Michael snapped under the weight of angry phone calls, his temper flaring in ways my daughter had never seen. Their arguments spilled out in public, at restaurants, in parking lots, whispered but visible cracks in the picture-perfect life they had promised each other. I remained silent through it all. No outbursts, no confrontations, just quiet, deliberate withdrawals of the lifeline they had taken for granted. And in that silence, I found power. They had laughed at me, treated me like an outsider at my own daughter's wedding. But I had the one thing they underestimated: control over what was mine. Barbara tried to cover it, of course. She spread whispers that I had pulled out at the last minute out of spite. But the truth didn't need defending. Every vendor, every canceled plan, every unpaid bill told the story louder than I ever could. And as I sat in my modest living room, sipping tea from the same old chipped mug, I felt no guilt, only clarity. Love doesn't mean allowing yourself to be walked over. Sacrifice doesn't mean surrendering your dignity. They had made their choices, and I had made mine. The revenge wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel, it was precise, and it was only the beginning. The thing about humiliation is that once it begins to spread, it takes on a life of its own. What started inside that reception hall, my quiet act of reclaiming my envelope, didn't stay there. By the time the wedding photos were supposed to be released, by the time the vendors began speaking among themselves, the whispers had already traveled far beyond those glittering chandeliers. In our town, reputations move faster than truth. People talk in grocery store aisles, in church pews, at backyard barbecues, and soon enough the story everyone repeated wasn't about a lavish wedding filled with roses and champagne. It was about how the so-called wealthy in-laws couldn't even cover their own bills. It was about vendors storming out unpaid, about a canceled honeymoon, about photos being held hostage until balances were cleared. The laughter that once rang in Barbara's voice now echoed back at her through gossip. Her friends, the ones who once leaned close to her at galas and charity luncheons, began to ask pointed questions. Didn't you say everything was handled? I thought your family had it all covered. Her smugness had backfired. Where once she flaunted her influence, now she had become the cautionary tale. The woman who built a kingdom on air and watched it collapse in public. My daughter, caught in the middle, was no longer radiant. The glow she carried on her wedding day dimmed quickly as reality set in. When she walked into church the following Sunday, heads turned, smiles were polite, but conversations hushed when she passed. The same people who had once celebrated her engagement now whispered about her silence at the wedding, about how she allowed her mother to be humiliated, while her husband's family pretended to hold power they never had. At home, her new marriage began to fray. Michael, stripped of the illusion of control, turned his bitterness on her. His sharp words cut deeper than Barbara's ever had. He blamed her for not keeping me in line, for not managing the situation better, for allowing his family to look foolish. Nights once filled with laughter became filled with arguments. He raised his voice, pacing the floor, listing every way her choice to side with his family had backfired. Your mother made us look like fools. He would spit, and you let her. You chose them over her, and now we're the ones paying for it. But beneath his anger was a truth my daughter couldn't ignore. She had traded loyalty for pride, love for appearances, and she had chosen wrong. She began to call me again, not with arrogance, not with indifference, but with a hesitation that spoke of regret. Her voicemails were longer now, softer, filled with apologies she had once been too proud to say. Mom, I didn't mean for it to go that far. I thought it would get better after the wedding. I should have stood up for you. Her words cracked under the weight of guilt, but I stayed silent. She had made her choice in that hall, and choices carry consequences. Barbara, meanwhile, could no longer hold her head high in the community she once dominated. Invitations slowed. Whispers followed her at gatherings. The same women who once envied her designer bags now mocked the story of the plaque, of the unpaid balances, of the mother who walked away with her envelope and left her exposed. Her laughter, the one that rang so loud when that plaque was placed in my hands, was now the very thing people remembered most. And not with admiration, with ridicule. The mighty fall quietly at first, then all at once. Barbara had built her image on control and arrogance, but now, when her name was spoken, it wasn't with respect. It was with smirks and shaking heads. And my daughter, she was left standing in the ruins of what she thought was a new beginning. The cracks in her marriage widened with every unpaid bill, every canceled plan, every sideways glance in public. She realized too late that she had silenced her mother to please a family who could not even stand on their own. She had traded the one person who loved her unconditionally for the approval of people who valued image more than loyalty. And in the quiet of her regrets, she finally understood the lesson Barbara never could. Money can't buy respect, and pride can't build love. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I didn't claw for their respect or beg for a place at their table. I simply took back what was mine. And that silence, oh, that silence, was louder than any words I could have spoken that night. For weeks after, the phone calls came in waves. At first, they were laced with anger, accusations about how I had ruined her perfect day, how I had humiliated her in front of Michael's family, how I had made everything harder than it needed to be. I listened without saying a word, letting her fill the silence with her desperation. Because silence, I learned, is not emptiness. Silence is power. Months passed, and the tone of her calls shifted. The sharpness in her voice dulled, replaced with cracks of regret. I heard it in the way she stumbled over her words, in the pauses between her sentences where pride wrestled with guilt. One evening, her voice broke completely. "Mom, I was wrong. I shouldn't have let them do that to you. I shouldn't have laughed along. Please, forgive me." I closed my eyes and let the words hang in the air. Forgiveness, such a heavy word. It wasn't that I didn't love her. I did, fiercely, in a way she may never truly understand. But love and trust are not twins. Love can remain even after trust has been shattered. But once that glass breaks, no amount of apology can make it whole again. She wanted me back in her life, as though nothing had happened, but I knew better. I had spent years giving and giving, pouring my sacrifices into a well that only deepened, never filled. That night at her wedding, when she let them hand me that plaque and laughed along, she showed me who she was willing to become for their approval. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I realized I had been living for everyone else, paying their bills, smoothing their paths, cushioning their falls. I had been the quiet strength behind my daughter's success, the hidden hand behind her dreams. But no one had ever asked about mine. No one had cared what I wanted, what I needed, what I had been waiting for. So I made a choice. The same envelope that once carried $140,000, the sum meant to buy her a house, her honeymoon, her perfect life, was reborn. I pulled it from the drawer where I had tucked it away and decided for the first time in decades to live for myself. I walked into a real estate office with a steady hand and signed the papers on a home that had always been out of reach when I was pouring my money into everyone else's comfort. A little cottage on the edge of town, quiet, surrounded by trees that swayed like they were applauding my courage. The air smelled of freedom there. Every corner of that home whispered my name. Not hers, not theirs, mine. Or perhaps in another life, another version of the story, I didn't buy a home. Perhaps I invested in a business idea I had buried for years, one that once lit a fire in me before life smothered it with responsibility. With that same envelope, I hired contractors, filed paperwork, and put my name on a sign above the door. A place that didn't just feed others, it fed me. My hands built something lasting, something mine. Whether it was the key to a new front door or the ink on a business license, the truth remained the same. I turned betrayal into a foundation. I turned heartbreak into bricks, into walls, into doors that opened to a future where I no longer asked permission to belong. So when my daughter called months later, voice trembling, asking if I could help pay their overdue bills, I smiled quietly to myself. For once, I had no guilt in saying no. Not with anger, not with bitterness, simply with finality, because my money was no longer hers to claim. It was mine to live. And that, my silent revenge, my sweetest twist, was that I didn't need to ruin her. I didn't need to destroy her marriage or tear down her in-laws. Life was already doing that without my hand. My only task was to step out of the shadows of sacrifice and into the light of my own dreams. For the first time, I wasn't her mother, the provider, the fixer, the safety net. I was a woman who had chosen herself, And that, in the end, was the loudest statement of all. Sometimes, revenge isn't about tearing others down. It isn't about shouting in their faces, throwing plates across the room, or demanding apologies that will never come. Revenge, in its truest form, is about reclaiming what they tried to take from you: your dignity, your worth, your voice. That night, when they placed that plaque in my hands and laughed at my expense, they wanted me to shrink. They wanted me to swallow the humiliation and accept the role of an outsider at my own daughter's wedding. But instead, I walked away, not broken, not bitter, but freer than I had ever been. I realized something in that silence as I walked toward the door with my envelope in my hands. Betrayal, as painful as it is, has a way of sharpening the soul. It forces you to see who is truly standing beside you and who is only pretending to. My daughter may share my blood, but in that moment, she chose to share her loyalty elsewhere. And that cut deeper than any insult Barbara could have hurled at me. But here's the twist they never saw coming. By pushing me out, they handed me back to myself. They gave me permission to stop living as everyone's foundation and start living as my own. I walked away stronger. I walked away richer. And I walked away knowing that sometimes blood isn't family, respect is, and respect, once lost, is nearly impossible to win back. If you're watching this far, don't leave without giving this video a like, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. And please, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story reached. Your support helps me keep telling these stories. So I leave you with one final question. One I've asked myself many nights since. If you were in my shoes, standing there with that plaque in your hands, treated as a stranger in the very moment you had sacrificed a lifetime to create, would you have walked away too?